Did you know that Frankie Lyman had a job at 9, was hustling prostitutes at 10, had his record career at 13, and was addicted to heroin by 15? Well, if you didn't know, you gonna learn today. Now check this out.
Hey everybody, this is Geneva of Genevas Closet Talk Show. Please make sure you like and share this video and subscribe to Genevas Closet if you haven't already done so right here on YouTube. And you can follow me on Facebook at Genevas Closet. And you can email me at genevascloset22@gmail.com. Now, let's get into the news.
Do you remember the 1998 film Why Do Fools Fall in Love, portraying the life of Frankie Lyman and his 3 wives? And you know the movie with Lorenz Tate, who played as Frankie Lyman, Vivica A. Fox, who played as Elizabeth Waters, Holly Berry, who played as Zola Taylor, and Leela Rashawn, who played as Amira Eagle. And they did such a fantastic job. But have you ever wondered how much of the movie is based on true facts? Well, I know I did, and I went and did my little research because you know I'm nosy, and I wanted to give you the most authentic version of the truth, really coming from the horse's mouth, coming from the people's mouth. So this is what I found. Check this out. Before I get started, I just want to say that Frankie Lyman, what we all know him by, real name was Franklin Joseph Lyman, was born September 30th, 1942 in Harlem, New York, and died February 27th, 1968 in Harlem, New York. He was 25, going on 26 years old. If he would have just made it 7 more months to his birthday, September 30th in 1968, he would have been 26 years old. The article that I am reading from is coming from Ebony, and it was written January 1967, which was actually 1 year and a month before Frankie Lyman passed away. He was 24, going on 25 when this article was written, and it says, "Comeback of a child star. Singer Frankie Lyman returns to footlights after battle with drugs." The gaunt, unshaven man staggered aboard the crowded subway car at Harlem's 125th Street station, looked dazedly about him, then stumbled through the lurching car, mumbling incoherently as he bumped first into one and then another passenger while struggling to retain his balance. His suit was wrinkled and food-spotted. His eyes were vacant and glassy. The man paused, then half sat, half fell into a seat. Completely oblivious of his surroundings, he stared into space, laughing softly to himself, humming snatches of a song and occasionally addressing an inaudible remark to no one in particular. Seated across the aisle, 2 middle-aged women who had observed his erratic behavior looked at one another, sharing frowns of revulsion. "Another dope addict," one said. "It's a disgrace. I don't see why the police allow them to roam the streets. That man should be in a hospital or behind bars." The 2 women did not know, and it is doubtful if any of the other subway riders were aware that the ill-kempt figure was 24-year-old singer Frankie Lyman, who only 10 years earlier was regarded as the show world's most promising child star. For more than 5 years, he had wallowed in the hopeless muck and mire of a dope addict's existence, enslaved by a habit which had cost him his career, his health, and self-respect. Today, at an age when most entertainers are still struggling to get their first break, Frankie, who was an international celebrity at 13, a down and out has been at 19, and by his own description, a dope-crazed derelict at 22, has started on the long road back to respectability and hopefully stardom. One hot afternoon last August, more than 2,000 teenage youngsters attended an outdoor block party held by a group of nuns at a Catholic settlement house in the Bronx section of New York City. The guest of honor was Frankie Lyman. The event, which was unnoticed by most newspapers, marked Frankie's return to show business after 33 days in New York Manhattan's General Hospital, during which time he was treated for and presumably cured of his addiction to narcotics. I have been born again, Frankie proclaimed to his teenage audience. I'm not ashamed to let the public know I took the cure. Maybe my story will keep some other kid from going wrong. Before Frankie sought medical aid last July to overcome his addiction, he was a pathetic creature prowling the streets of New York, searching out old show business friends for a loan to buy a bag of heroin, to jolt his shattered nervous system into temporary oblivion. Then, in a few hours, the insatiable craving would return and he'd be off hunting for more money, for still another bag and another jolt. Mercifully, most people seeing the hollow-eyed, disheveled figure staggering through the streets and sleeping in subway cars did not recognize him as Frankie Lyman. I looked twice my age. I was thin as a shadow, and I didn't give a damn, Frankie confesses. My own concern was getting in relief. You know, an addict is the most pathetic creature on earth. He knows that every time he sticks a needle in his arm, he's gambling with death, and yet he's got to have it. It's like playing Russian roulette with the spike. There's always the danger that some peddler will sell him a poison batch, some garbage. He pauses, searching for wood to rap on. I was lucky. God must have been watching over me. Just before I went into the hospital, I was spending about $75 a day for the stuff. But nobody ever sold me a bad fix. If they had, I probably wouldn't be around to talk about it today. Dope peddlers and junkies hounded his footsteps, lurking backstage at clubs where he was fortunate enough to get work, milking him of every penny he could earn or beg to buy another fix. The height of his shame arrived in February 1966 when Frankie was arrested on charges of stealing a set of drums from a recording studio and pawning them to finance his habit. He insists to this day that it was a bum rap, that he was accused because he was generally known he needed money and knew the location of the drums. Despite his denials, Frankie was arraigned on a burglary charge and, as of this writing, still faces trial. Confident he will ultimately be vindicated, he is not as much concerned about his arrest as he is about the possible damage that publicity about the case will do to his attempted comeback. Undoubtedly, women were nearly as much to blame for the moral and physical disposition of young Frankie Lyman as was narcotics. Indeed, it was a woman more than twice his age who introduced the impressionable youngster to heroin when he was only 15. Even at 15, however, the handsome teenager was no stranger to drugs or women. You know, he muses, I never was a child, although I was billed in every theater and auditorium where I appeared as a child star. I was a man when I was 11 years old, doing everything that most men do. In the neighborhood where I live, there was no time to be a child. There were 5 children in my family, and my folks had to scuffle to make ends meet. My father was a truck driver, and my mother worked as a domestic in white folks' homes. While most kids my age were playing stickball and marbles, I was working in the corner grocery store carrying orders to help pay the rent. I've known all about women as long as I can remember. When I was 10, I made a good living hustling prostitutes for the white man who would come up to Harlem looking for Negro girls. I knew every prostitute in our neighborhood, and I get a commission for every customer I brought them. I was a fresh young kid, and some of them thought I was cute. Sometimes they paid me off with some extra. I learned everything there was to know about women before I was 12 years old. The wistful little boy's smile still crinkles the corners of his mouth when he is amused, and the missing tooth gives him an impish kind of charm when he laughs, but the eyes are jaded and wise beyond their years. The kids in my neighborhood grew up fast, he recalls. Smoking pot, marijuana, was so commonplace the kids 11 and 12 years old puff reefers on the street corners. I had been smoking marijuana when I was in grade school, but I didn't start using the real stuff, heroin, until I got into show business. At the height of his popularity, Frankie Lyman was about 14 years old and earning as much as $5,000 per week for personal appearances. The first recording cut by Frankie and his vocal group, the Teenagers, was entitled Why Do Fools Fall in Love and grossed about $500,000 in sales. Our recording was making bells of money, and every major theater and auditorium in the U.S. and Europe was bidding for us. But we were still considered children, incapable of handling our own earnings, Frankie recalls. As a result, 3 lawyers were hired to handle our money for us, and we were given about $40 a piece each week for spending change. The rest went into a trust fund, which we were to receive when we reached manhood. For Frankie, a 14-year-old with adult lust, the shortage of cash was, in his words, a real drag. I meet all kind of chicks, but I never could ball them the way I wanted to because I didn't have any money. You had to have some kind of money, if only to buy drinks. Of course, you could get away with buying some ice cream sodas for the Bobby Soxers, but I never liked the screaming teenage types. They didn't know anything about life. I went for women 25 or older. They were less trouble and more rewarding. Frankie confesses that he passed most of his sweethearts off as his mother or older sister to avoid possible scandal. After all, he declares, the public regarded me as a clean-cut, wholesome kid, and my manager and advisors wanted me to keep that image. The sex-crazed youngster first big show business romance was with a nightclub dancer who later accompanied him on his tours while posing as his mother. I first met her at a party given in honor of my group when we were playing L.A. This gorgeous doll walked up, pinched my cheek, and said, "Oh, isn't he cute?" I told her, "You not so bad yourself, baby. You sure look good to me." I guess she was pretty shocked. She said, "You shouldn't talk to your elders like that." I asked her, "How about us going to breakfast after your last show?" Later, I bought her a couple of fifths and took her back to my room. It didn't take long for the news of the child star's love-making prowess to make the rounds. In show business, Frankie declares, gossip travels fast. Pretty soon I had a whole stable of women, one in every city. Of course, having them pose as my mother had its disadvantages. I couldn't be seen drinking with them. And once my little game was nearly exposed, when a newspaper reporter who had been introduced to one of my mothers in New York caught my act in Chicago and was introduced to another of my mothers. I had a hard time convincing him that he had seen the same woman in both cities, especially since they looked nothing alike. Frankie, the boy who never was a child, was snatched from the obscurity of his Harlem slum neighborhood at 13 and catapulted into national prominence by a one-in-a-million quirk of fate, the kind of coincidence which is the grist of cheap novels. There were 5 of us, and we used to harmonize every night on the street corner until the neighbors would call the cops to run us away. One night, an older guy named Richard Barrett, who sang with an established group called the Valentines, heard us rehearsing in the hallway of an apartment house and asked us if we'd like to come downtown and audition for a small recording company, which was just getting started. Excited at the prospect of winning a recording contract, the group arrived at the studio to discover that more than 60 other singing groups from all over the city had been extended the same invitation. We waited from 6 p.m. until 2 in the morning before they finally got around to hearing us, Frankie declares. Then, when they told us we had won, we couldn't believe our ears. The original song the group had chosen for their audition had been inspired by an essay which Frankie had written a few weeks earlier for his 7th grade English class at Stitt Junior High School. Appalled by the sordidness all around him, the common law relationships of many grown-ups in his neighborhood, and the unhappy married lives of others, the precocious 13-year-old chosen Why Do Fools Fall in Love as the cynical theme for his essay. We had to come up with an original tune right away, and I got the idea of putting music to the essay I had written, Frankie reveals. It took me about 2 hours to work the song. The tune, waxed less than a week after the audition, distributed under the label of G Records, a previously unknown recording company, racked up a fantastic 2.5 million sales in less than a year and established Frankie Lyman and his Teenagers as the nation's leading singing group. Dazzled by newspapers and television fanfare, their heads spinning with dizzying dreams of new and more fabulous worlds to conquer, the five new overnight sensations embarked on an extensive tour, a 6-month odyssey which was to take them into theaters and concert halls in 50 major U.S. cities and to London, Scotland, Dublin, Paris, and Sydney, Australia. Accompanying them was Morris Levy, former president of G Records, who was so impressed by the group's potential that he had resigned to devote his energies to managing Frankie and the teenagers. Almost from the very beginning, there was bickering when the group originally had been organized. The five boys had called themselves the Teenagers, and there had been no lead singer. Frankie, at 13, the youngest member of the group, sang first tenor but rarely was called upon to solo. Now, because he had written and sung the solo in Why Do Fools Fall in Love, the record company had renamed the group Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. Later, during the tour, the name was modified again, this time to Frankie Lyman and his Teenagers. Members of the group, resentful of being pushed further and further into the background, rebelled. There were constant arguments over the wording of newspaper advertisements and theater billings. On several occasions, the tour was nearly sabotaged by fistfights and threats of a sit-down strike by Frankie's disgruntled fellow singers. By spring of 1957, tensions between Frankie and the members of his group had reached the crisis stage, and the manager, Morris Levy, decided something had to be done. His decision was to allow Frankie to split with the group and go out on his own as a single. At that time, it was felt that we could make twice as much money with two separate and independent acts as we could with one, Frankie discloses. At first, it seemed that the idea would really work. I cut Ella Fitzgerald's old song, Goody Goody, on my own without the group, and it sold 1 million copies. Money was rolling in for a while, but then things began to go wrong. We found that many club and theater owners weren't as willing to pay top dollar for only part of the original group. The slowly dwindling prestige of both acts fell even more when the Teenagers, following in Frankie's footsteps, cut a record on their own without him. The tune, entitled Flip Flop, was appropriately named, Frankie declares wryly. It was one of the biggest flops waxed by the company that year, and to make matters worse, people associated the record with me, although I wasn't on it. Frankie's problems with narcotics began in 1958, about the same time that his career took a nosedive. I'm the kind of guy who either has it all good or all bad. When things started going bad for me, the roof really caved in. Today, sitting in the barely furnished 4th floor Harlem walk-up apartment where his family has lived for 25 years, Frankie reflects upon the past and plots out strategy for his return to the top. He realizes better than anyone that the odds are double stacked against him. It is an unwritten show business law that child stars just don't make it the second time around. Shirley Temple, Jackie Coogan, and Frank Sugar Child Robinson are only a few of the has-beens whose names once were show business magic. Frankie has an honest and efficient personal manager, retired dancer Sam Bray, who literally pulled Frankie out of a Harlem gutter early in 1966, cleaned him up, and persuaded him to take the cure. When Frankie came out of the hospital, he signed a contract with Bray. Bray, who earns a modest income of about $200 a week as inspector for a food products company in the Bronx, admits that the biggest obstacle facing Frankie is his comeback attempt is financial. A star needs many things, he declares. He needs a repertoire of good arrangements, a flashy wardrobe, vocal coaching, things that cost big money. All that Frankie has going for him now is talent and guts. Other than a few frayed Rogers Pete suits, which are now much too small for him to wear, Frankie has little to show for his teenage heydays when he and his group earned more than $500,000 in a single year. Adding to Frankie's comeback problems is the fact that some people don't believe his dope cure will last. Promoters, nightclub, and theater owners, aware that few addicts succeed is permanently shaking the monkey off their backs, are openly reluctant to booking an entertainer whose cravings may cause him to miss performances. Frankie admits that this is not the first time he has tried to kick the narcotics habit. He made a short-lived attempt to shake the monkey in 1960, about a year after he had become addicted. He had learned to use a hypodermic needle during a New York party where a lot of musicians were shooting the stuff. A woman at the same party showed him to skin pop, to prick the skin with the needle to get a mild kick. I never intended to get hooked on dope, he recalls. I knew it was bad at first, and I was content to just skin popping, but soon I got daring, and it wasn't long before I was injecting the stuff right into my veins. Bob Redcross, a veteran show business performer who was Frankie's road manager for a while, took the young singer under his protective wing. Bob talked to me like a father, Frankie reveals. He tried to make me realize that dope could ruin my life. He told me about other entertainers whose lives had been cut short by addiction, people he knew personally like Charlie Parker. He made me move into his house on Long Island where he could be around me all the time to make sure I wasn't sneaking drugs. Frankie was making good progress in conquering his addiction when personal tragedy plunged him into deep depression. His 39-year-old mother, ill for more than a year with terminal cancer, died unaware until the end that she had the disease. We never told her the truth, Frankie reveals. She believed she was going to get well. I used to go to the hospital and tell her to hurry and get well so she could come with me on my next overseas tour. One of the last things she asked me before she died was if I had overcome my habit. I told her, "Mama, don't worry. I'm doing the best I can." Bob's taking good care of me. 4 months later, she died. Despondent over his mother's death, the 18-year-old entertainer returned to narcotics to deaden his grief. 5 long years passed before he met Sam Bray early in 1966 and made his second attempt to overcome his addiction. At 24, Frankie is far more mature and self-assured than he was at 18, and this fact alone may enable him to sustain his cure. I know that many people aren't convinced that I have kicked the habit for good, he declares, but I know, and that's the main thing. Sooner or later, the skeptics will get around to believing me. Meanwhile, I'm content to wait. I'm reading from MichiganRockandRollLegends.com, dated for April 15th, 2021, and it says, Frankie Lymon's tombstone, Blues 5, The Wives. When Frankie Lymon died from a heroin overdose in 1968, he was broke and trying again for a comeback that he never achieved. He left no fortune, but his name was listed as one of the songwriters of Why Do Fools Fall in Love? It was the hit that made him and the Teenagers famous back in 1956. And the song, and that one song he recorded that remained both popular and valuable over the years. During 1965, the copyright for Why Do Fools Fall in Love was changed. The names of Frankie Lymon and Morris Levy were now listed as the songwriters. Levy was the head of Roulette Records, the independent label that bought out the G label, which originally released the record. Back in 1956, the hit song had first been credited to Frankie Lymon, Herman Santiago, and George Goldner, head of G Records. It was modified to just Lymon and Goldner on subsequent records for the next decade before Goldner's name was replaced by Levy's. Most record buyers did not become aware of this latest change until The Happenings recorded a cover version of Why Do Fools Fall in Love in 1967 with Levy's name listed on the label. In 1984, as the original copyright term of Why Do Fools Fall in Love was expiring, Elmira Eagle Lymon brought suit in U.S. District Court in New York against Morris Levy, his record label, and his publishing company. Her complaint charged fraud, misappropriation, and copyright infringement, among other offenses. She attempted to recover all the royalties from the date of the record's release because she alleged that neither Levy nor his predecessor as co-writer George Goldner, who discovered and recorded the Teenagers, was actually a songwriter. Back in the 1950s, when a starstruck group like the Teenagers finally got to audition for the head of a record company, such matters as copyright barely figured in the conversation. Kids don't know about royalties, said Bob Hyde of Murray Hill Records. They wanted to impress their friends in school by being on the radio. Like the jazz and blues artists before them, the rock and roll rollers of the 1950s and 1960s were were often ripe for ripoffs, and royalties were underestimated or simply never paid. It was also not uncommon for an agent, producer, or record label head to name himself co-writer of a group's song, thereby entitling him to half of the author's publishing royalties. No one could have foreseen that the people who grew up with the music would refuse to relinquish it, and the songs would be repeatedly recycled into movie soundtracks and albums, cover versions, oldie compilations, and television commercials. Why Do Fools Fall in Love was a prime example, and its publishing rights may have earned a lot of money by 1984, according to Chuck Rubin of Artists' Rights Enforcement Corp. Rubin established his organization in 1981 to represent artists who believed had been deprived of their earnings by their record companies. Artists' Rights Enforcement Corporation was heralded by the New York Times as the White Knight of rock and roll for its efforts in recovering collected royalties for a host of artists, including Wilbert Harrison, Richard Berry, the Coasters, and the Del Vikings, just to name a few. It was Rubin who several years earlier came to the conclusion that Lymon's estate was not receiving appropriate royalties. He then located Amira, put her in touch with an attorney, and helped line up witnesses and documentation. Her adversary, Morris Levy, was a powerful force in the music business. He was characterized as the octopus by Variety magazine for his far-reaching control and power in the record industry and his connections to organized crime. At one point, Levy owned more than 90 companies that employed 900 people. These included record pressing plants, tape duplicating plants, a distribution company, a prominent New England chain of record stores, and numerous record labels. Levy ruled his empire with an iron hand, using both fear and intimidation as part of his business model. In his book, Me, the Mob, and the Music, Tommy James characterized Levy as willing to strong-arm the artists signed to Roulette, and that the label was notorious for not paying its artists for their record sales. In one disturbing incident, James wrote that Levy arranged a 1967 attack on former Roulette artist Jimmy Rogers by an off-duty police officer in response to Rogers' repeated demands for unpaid royalties he was owed by the label. Rogers, who had been Roulette's top-selling artist in the 50s and early 60s with his #1 hit Honeycomb and 26 other charting singles, suffered traumatic head injuries from a blunt instrument in the beating. Amira's case was just beginning when Elizabeth Waters Lyman petitioned the surrogate court claiming that she was Frankie Lymon's widow, and Zola Taylor also objected, claiming that she was Lymon's rightful widow. With the matter now in a confused state, the federal judge stayed Amira's lawsuit. It was put on hold until the completion of a new trial to determine which of the three women Frankie Lymon was said to have married, but none of whom he ever divorced, was his rightful widow and heir. Morris Levy had not become a force in the music business through fear alone. He was also very clever. Frankie Lymon had been on his record label for most of his career, and Levy knew much more about the singer than Amira, who had only been with him for 1 year. Levy was aware of all the details of Frankie Lymon's love life, and he used it to his advantage by bringing in Elizabeth Waters and Zola Taylor to challenge Amira's claim to be Frankie's widow, and by having the court determine her married to be invalid and derail her lawsuit. As soon as the hearing began, Amira's attorney alleged that the other two widows acted in concert with Morris Levy. They pointed to the contracts that Elizabeth and Zola signed with Levy's publishing business, Big 7 Music Corp. Each assigned the song's copyright to Big 7 in exchange for an advance, $10,000 for Elizabeth and $7,500 for Zola, against her share of future royalties. Believing that she had the stronger case, Big 7 agreed to pay Elizabeth an additional $5,000 if the federal lawsuit was dismissed because the plaintiff, Amira, was determined to not be the legal widow. Levy's attorney responded that the agreements with Elizabeth and Zola amounted to standard industry contracts. He claimed that both women thought that their agreements with Levy were fair and that neither planned to take legal action against him if she is found to be Frankie's widow. Levy declined direct comment of the Lyman matter. He was busy preparing for an April 11th trial for extortion and conspiracy in federal court in Camden, New Jersey, stemming from an FBI investigation of organized crime in the record industry. Levy had been arrested earlier in 1986 as part of the FBI probe. Meanwhile, Paula Spann, a reporter, used both interviews and court testimony to profile each of the widows in her story. Elizabeth Waters was a struggling part-time bill collector from Philadelphia. She told the judge that Frankie Lyman was a charmer. He had the type of personality that would draw people, she said. She met Frankie when he was 20 years old, backstage at some ballroom in New York City. By 1962, Frankie's career had been in decline for several years, but she had nevertheless come with 2 girlfriends to meet her one-time idol. Frankie was addicted to drugs and alcohol, and Elizabeth, who was 19 at the time, was sympathetic. She told the court that she wanted to help him get back on his feet and regain all he had lost. But that trying to help him wasn't enough. Frankie was that kind of person, Your Honor, Elizabeth said. I can't just sit there and tell the court anything different. Frankie could fool you. He could fool me. Frankie could fool God. That's why we're here today. Elizabeth testified that she and Frankie had started living together shortly after they met. She had insisted that he check himself into a Manhattan hospital to cure his drug habit. He was clean for a time when she became pregnant in 1963. He was deeply saddened by the death of their infant daughter. Paula Spann reported that Frankie and Elizabeth got married in Alexandria, Virginia in early 1964. It didn't last long, however. Frankie had started using heroin again, and she was forced to hide the money from his occasional gigs in a hole in the wall of their apartment to prevent him from using it to buy drugs. As a result, they fought and separated numerous times. Elizabeth also acknowledged in court that she started using heroin and cocaine at this point. She also turned to prostitution to support her daughter from her first marriage to one Charles Phillips. When she was just 16, Spann wrote that Elizabeth called her work as a prostitute moonlighting in her testimony, and that Elizabeth said that she had been arrested for it about 15 or 20 times. Frankie sort of changed my life, she told the judge. A lot of people say I knew him so long, I became him. Stay tuned for part 2 of Who was Frankie Lyman and what happened to him? Look, everybody, I tried to shorten this documentary up, but I couldn't help it. There's just too many interesting facts to the story. We ain't even got into what else happened with Amira. Don't even get me started with Zola Taylor. Did we even discuss really what happened with his mom and his dad and his grandmother? Did you know that his brothers were in the music industry too? Then I heard from this lady, she said she used to date Frankie and she just got her own little conspiracy theories. And then did you know that there's actually a whole conspiracy theory about him being killed? Yes, people think that he was murdered, but we'll get into it. Stay tuned for part 2.
I would like to know how you all feel about this situation, and while you are letting me know, could you please like and share this video and subscribe to Genevas Closet if you haven't already done so right here on YouTube. And you can follow me on Facebook at Genevas Closet, and you can email me at genevascloset22@gmail.com. You all have a fabulous day, and I will talk to you later. Bye.